So we've got a beautiful selection of vegetables, but not really vegetables. These are actually mushrooms or fungi, and there's a basic difference between vegetables and fungi. Vegetables take sustenance from the sun. They create chlorophyll through photosynthesis. That's not the way that mushrooms operate. As a fungi, they're not dependent on sunlight for their sustenance. Instead, they break down plant matter and they draw sustenance from that. So you may see them growing on trees where they're taking sustenance from trees. A lot of the commercial mushrooms you see here are grown on a sterile growing medium that gives the mushrooms what they need. The other thing that's curious about mushrooms and makes them different from plants is that inherent in mushrooms is a structure that's made up of a fiber called chitin, and it's the same fiber that builds your fingernails or the shells of shrimp. And so mushrooms walk this very fine line between plant matter and animal matter. There's a great deal of protein in here, and I think chitin is partially responsible for that. So let's take a look at what we've got. Certainly you recognize here field mushrooms. These are the common white button mushrooms that you'll find in the supermarket. If you keep them in an environment like a plastic bag that stays very, very moist, quickly they will begin to break down. Here, as an example, is a mushroom that just lived too long in a plastic bag. If you look on the other side, this is a field mushroom, but it's got a little bit of a brown coloration on the top. This is a cremini mushroom. And many of the original field mushrooms were brown like that, and then they were bred to be white. People decided they preferred a white mushroom. If a cremini mushroom like this gets a little bit too large, it turns into a very different mushroom, and that is the portobello. So this portobello is just an over-mature cremini mushroom. Now, if I flip this over, what you'll see is that the cap now is flat, and underneath you can see all the gills, these little striations underneath. If a plant reproduces through seeds, a mushroom reproduces using spores, and the spores fall from between these gills and they hit the ground, and if the conditions are right and the food is there, they will grow. The last and maybe most curious thing about mushrooms is that as you look at this beautiful selection of mushrooms, these are actually not the plant. This is the fruit. The plant itself actually grows underneath the forest litter and in the soil, and if you've dug into that, you've maybe seen these white threads. It's called mycelium, and that is the actual mushroom plant. And it grows and it looks for food, it breaks down vegetable matter, it grows onto trees, onto leaves, onto litter, and then when the conditions are right in terms of temperature and in terms of moisture, it will fruit and send up mushrooms like this. That's the way it happens in the wild anyhow. In a commercial setting, they choose a sterile growing medium, they inoculate it with spores, they create the right conditions, and boom, you've got mushrooms. So down here in the front is the only wild mushroom that I've got in the mix. This is a morel, and this morel cannot be grown or cultivated. Can't be grown in captivity. I guess that's one way of describing it. This grows only in the wild. They've not found a way to grow it or cultivate it. When you buy wild mushrooms like this over cultivated, be aware that there's probably going to be a lot of dirt and maybe even some insects. As an example, this morel, when it grows, is actually hollow on the inside. And if I cut it open, I'll let you see that. And it's not uncommon that you will find insects or dirt on the inside. So washing them carefully is a good idea. Let me set this aside for just a second and real briefly show you what I've got here. This is a selection of dried mushrooms. And we're not talking about fresh produce anymore. No, this is mushrooms that have been dried. But the reason I brought them out is to raise a point with you about mushrooms and the flavor of mushrooms. Mushrooms have a quality, a savory quality that's associated with protein. The Japanese call it umami. And umami is a flavor that we recognize because it's indicative of readily available protein, something that we all need to survive. So we've evolved to recognize umami. So if you're doing vegetable cookery and you like the idea of just cooking vegetables, you might discover that you miss the savory flavor associated with animal protein. Enter the mushroom and suddenly you have all manner of this umami flavor that you can take advantage of and build into your food. So let me set the dried mushrooms aside. What I would like to do is make a vegetable pot pie. Not a meat pot pie like a chicken pot pie, but a vegetable pot pie, and I'm going to use mushrooms to lend a really meaty flavor to the preparation. The first thing I want to do is create a mushroom stock. Not a chicken stock, not a beef stock, but a mushroom stock. And it's going to have in it shallots. No surprises there. I'm going to put in whole cloves of garlic as well. And then I've gathered up a lot of mushrooms that I have on hand. It might be mushrooms that are a little bit over the hill. It might be the stems of mushrooms that I don't want to put into a dish. I've included some dried mushrooms. So all of these are going to go in with a bay leaf or two. Now I would say mushrooms like this that are a little bit tired, let's go ahead and add those as well. I'm just going to crush them up and put them in. Okay, to this I'm going to add some sweet marsala, a little sweet wine, and we're going to cover these with water. Keep in mind they'll cook down, so you don't actually have to cover them right up front. And we're going to put them on, bring them to a boil, reduce it to a simmer, and let them cook for about an hour or so. Vegetables give up their flavor very quickly. When it's done, I end up with a beautiful stock like this. There is that mouth-watering, savory, umami quality that I was referencing before. And if you take a look, I can press out even a little bit more liquid here. But what I have in the strainer is all of the mushrooms that have given up their flavor for the greater good. I even have a little bit right here that we're going to capture. And we'll set this aside. All right, so now I have a stock, and that stock is going to be used to make a sauce. In the French tradition, they have something called velouté, or velvet, a velvety sauce. And it's basically a stock thickened with flour and butter. And so I'm going to do that right now. So you can follow a recipe for roux, which is the thickening agent for the sauce, but really it's about 60% flour and about 40% butter. And we're going to put the flour in there. Now, flour is made up primarily of starch. Flour probably has around 11% protein in it as well, but mostly what it is starch. And when those starch granules begin to cook in liquid, they swell and absorb liquid, and that's the way a sauce begins to thicken. If there's a challenge, it's that if you put the starch, like the flour, right into the liquid when it's hot, it thickens so quickly it forms lumps. And so what cooks have learned over the years is that you take the flour and you put it into fat, and that separates the starch granules so that little by little, when they absorb liquid, they aren't inclined to stick to one another and form lumps. All right, in goes the flour. And you're looking for a mixture that is thick, but still liquid enough to be stirred. Now, the reason for cooking it is this, that the flour has a raw flavor, and I can get rid of that raw flavor by cooking it. But more than that, if I were making a dark preparation, like a sauce for mushrooms that features a dark stock, I could build some flavor into this thickener just by browning it a little bit. And while that might not be appropriate for a white sauce, and so I would keep the roux just like this, barely colored, for a dark sauce like that, I might want to cook it all the way until it looks like peanut butter in the pan. Might take 5 or 10 minutes, and you've got to stir it so it doesn't scorch and burn. The way to tell that your roux is properly cooked, especially for a white roux, would be this. Just take a small amount of the roux out, and when it's cooled, you don't want to burn yourself, but when it's cooled, take it and rub it between your thumb and forefinger, and if it feels a little sandy, you've cooked it enough. All right, so we've moved now beyond white roux, and I'm going forward and making sort of a blonde roux. A blonde roux would likely be appropriate for a sauce made with chicken stock for chicken preparations. So I'm just going to share with you an idea, and that is that when you mix liquid into a roux, it's really handy if they can be at opposite temperature extremes. If you have a hot roux, have room temperature or cool liquid. If you have a hot stock, have cool roux. And the reason for that is if both of these things are hot, when they come together, the thickening is almost too fast. You can't keep up with it, and it forms lumps. If, on the other hand, they are both cold, you'll put them together, and while it won't form any lumps, you'll have to stir and stir and stir for a long time. The best possible scenario is have one of these or the other hot and the other cold. That will slow down the thickening just enough so you can keep up with it. So that's what I'm going to do. I have a hot roux, and into that I'm going to add a little bit of stock. You can see how hot that roux was, and likely you can see that it thickened almost immediately. I'm going to add more, and again it will thicken quickly, but I'm leveraging the thickness of this liquid, or the thickness of this sauce, to break up any lumps. We'll continue to add stock until this is smooth and almost liquid. You'll see it here in just a flash. So it just went beyond being about the thickness of tomato paste, and now it's almost liquid. It's like thinned out tomato paste, and we can take that as a good sign and go ahead and add the rest of our stock and just smooth it out. I'm going to take a whisk and just break up any lumps that may have formed in here. I'm going to turn this into a cream sauce just by adding some cream to the same pan. Not so much that it stops tasting like mushrooms, because I think that's important to me, but I want it to taste rich as well. We can add a little bit of salt to this and some pepper, and be a little bit careful about evaluating the consistency of this sauce before it comes back to a boil. Because if there is still starch that hasn't quite thickened, you may discover your sauce getting a little bit thick. Okay, our sauce is up to a boil. Now, in terms of evaluating consistency, you can move it around in the pan, you can whisk it, you can pour it like this, but what a lot of chefs will do is they'll see how it coats the back of a spoon, especially if they draw their finger through there. And in about 3 seconds, it comes together. That kind of works for me. Okay, I'm going to move this to the back, a small burner. And we'll just let it simmer there gently while we move on with this recipe. This is going to be a mushroom pot pie. And to that end, I want there to be a lot of mushrooms in there. So I chose some. I've got morels. These are the wild mushrooms, so make sure you clean them very carefully. I'm going to put a variety in there. So here's maitake mushrooms. I'll grab some of those. We'll take these beauties. And this trumpet royale. I'm going to dice up into smaller pieces because they're pretty large. But if you go to the expense of buying mushrooms like this, make sure they're recognizable. So we'll melt some butter, and while it comes up to temperature, I'm going to slice some shallots or dice some shallots. Okay, the butter's melted. The sizzling that you hear is the water boiling out of the butter. Not water, actually, it's buttermilk. Our sauce in the back looks great. Once that bubbling subsides, in goes my mushrooms. And sometimes you'll discover mushrooms just drinking up all the fat that's in the pan. They tend to be pretty thirsty. As the cell structure begins to break down a little bit in these mushrooms, they will release some of that fat, and you can encourage that just by introducing a little bit of liquid. That was a little splash of wine. I'm going to put it in the pan anyway, so I'm going to add it early. I don't want to simmer them in liquid, but that steam begins to break the mushrooms down, and it liberates some of the oil or the butter. The heat's up nice and high because I want to put some color on this. We've got that wonderful umami flavor, in just the same way you like a nice hard sear on a steak. Mushrooms will taste good if you give them a chance to brown. While they're cooking, I'm going to throw in some branches of thyme. I'll just throw them in whole. And because they're partially cooked, I'm going to add the shallots as well. I'm also seeing some of the mushroom juice evaporate and leave a little bit of film on the bottom of the pan, what the French would call fond or foundation. And I don't want that to burn. That's pure flavor. That's mushroom essence with the water cooked out. So I'm going to deglaze it with a little bit more liquid. Just clean that pan up. And each time I add wine to this preparation and it reduces, I get a little bit more acidity. All right, I'm happy with the mushrooms. I'm going to add the rest of the wine. And we're going to reduce that down until it's dry. And it won't take very long. Since I'm making a vegetable pot pie, not just mushroom, but vegetable, I have some other vegetables that I've diced up and roasted. I've got potatoes, I've got a winter squash, butternut squash, and here are some turnips. These have all been seasoned with salt and pepper, drizzled with a little bit of oil, and then roasted in a hot oven. And we're going to add those right along with the mushrooms. And I'm going to turn this off. So at this point, we're ready to finish this dish up. I've got the vegetable garniture. I've got the sauce made. I'm going to strain this real quickly, just in case there's any lumps. And I'll finish up the seasoning, and then we'll build our pot pie. Now, we're going to serve this in a small pot, something like that. And I want to put pastry over the top. So I snuck away to the supermarket and I bought some puff pastry. I rolled it out and I cut it using a round cutter, just like that. And what I want to do is brush the top with egg wash. This is just an egg that's been beaten with about a tablespoon of water. And then I'm going to put a decorative design by dragging a fork across it one way and the other. And then I put that right onto a greased pan. That goes into an oven at about 400 degrees, and with about 10 or 12 minutes, it will have puffed up, and you'll discover something that looks just like that. So, last preparations. Sauce goes in with the vegetables, and I want it to get hot. And I just decided here and now that I'd be happier if there was a little parsley in there. So we'll add that to the dish. These could be done ahead, and then 10 minutes before you're ready to serve it, put it into an oven at about 350 degrees. It comes out steaming hot. Take the baked pastry, put it right on top, and that dinner is ready to be enjoyed. Vegetable pot pie with the umami flavor that only mushrooms have. So, I'd love to make some mushroom tamales with you. They're one of my favorite dishes, and while they're a little involved, it's well worth the effort. Let's get started making a filling for the tamales. And as I said, it's going to have mushrooms in it, but I have already some onions that have been sliced and they're cooking on the stove. They've just begun to brown a little bit. I'm going to add some garlic to there. So I'll take this clove of garlic and just slice it thin. There we go. And the garlic goes into the same pan. And then we're going to add some mushrooms. Now, I've got some maitakes and some trumpet royale, and I've got some field mushrooms here. Of the three of them, these field mushrooms are pretty dirty. And so my preferred method for dealing with that is to have a bowl of warm water, and you put the mushrooms in, and very quickly, you sort of give them a little scrub with your hands. Don't let them soak for a long time because they'll absorb a lot of water. And then lift them out of the water so that you leave the dirt behind. Okay? So there's all the dirt. We'll leave that behind. And these mushrooms need to get cut up and added to the pan. Maitakes, just get their stems cut off. And we'll cut it into big and recognizable pieces. We'll add those. The stems come off the trumpet royale. And then I'm going to cut them in half. And then sort of on a long bias like this. When I'm cutting up mushrooms, I don't cut them real thin because what I've discovered is that they have so much moisture in them that when the water cooks out, if you cut them too small, they kind of disappear. And that's not what I want at all. So I usually cut them about 1/4 of an inch thick, maybe a little bit less. Let's go ahead and deal with these field mushrooms or white mushrooms. Take the stems off so they sit flat. First I'll cut them in half, put them on their flat side, and then nice generous slices. Anytime you can put a flat side on a vegetable before you cut it, I would say it's a good idea. All right, we're going to saute those mushrooms along with the onions and garlic. I have a little bit of dried thyme. I'm going to introduce it now. And we'll let that cook. Now, what's going to bring heat to this filling is a roasted poblano chili. I roasted it over an open flame until it was blackened, and then I simply put it into a plastic bag so it could steam and the outside could soften, and then I wiped it clean. I didn't wash it because I want that smokiness. And I'm going to take this and cut it in half. I'm going to remove the seeds and the ribs both. And then we'll cut that into strips. Those are about 1 inch long, I would say. And those make their way in. I can hear from the sound of this pan that the heat is building up a little bit. And then I've got some tomatoes that I roasted. These can be roasted on a grill if you've got the grill going outside, or you can put them underneath the broiler. That's what we did here. And I want them to get soft and blacken a little bit. And then we can cut the core out. And then we'll peel away the worst of the blackened skin. It should pull right off very, very easily. I'm going to introduce this liquid and create a nice liquid filling. I'm going to bring this over to the edge of the board and just scrape the tomatoes right into the pan. Okay, so this filling is basically done. I don't want it to be watery, so I may need to cook it just long enough so that the tomato liquid can reduce. And as it's coming down, I'm going to make sure that we've got some salt and pepper in there. All right, next we're going to deal with the dough, or what the Mexicans would call masa. That's what I have here. This is the stuff that's ground a little bit more coarsely for tamales. And I'm going to mix some water into this. And we'll let it rehydrate. The water can be a little bit warm, so much the better. So there it is right there. We'll give that just a minute or two to rehydrate. We're going to whip that with some sort of fat. And traditionally what they use is lard. I have lard here. If you have objections to lard, you could use vegetable shortening as well. That would work, but you want a solid fat so that you can whip some air into it. So I'm going to take and add this lard right to the mixer. And we'll start mixing. I'm also going to introduce the masa. Periodically, you want to stop and just scrape the sides of the bowl. What they will do traditionally in Mexico is they'll whip this, and if the lard starts to warm up and get a little soft, they'll just take the whole bowl and they'll refrigerate it and then bring it back and whip it again. And once it's cold, they can whip even more air into it. And they do that so they get a nice light batter or a nice light dough. We can sort of take advantage of chemistry and introduce a little baking powder. I'm just going to put it in here. Just a small amount of baking powder, and when that cooks, it will lighten the masa. All right, now that we've whipped a good deal of air into this masa, I want to start to introduce liquid. And I've got some stock here. It can be chicken stock, it could be vegetable stock. If you had it on hand, a little bit of mushroom stock would be fine. And I'm looking to create a batter that is a little bit like a cake batter. It should hold its shape on a spoon, but it shouldn't be really hard the way this is here. So I'm going to add that, and we'll begin to add stock. So before we're all done with this batter, it's important that it be seasoned properly. And so I'm going to begin to add some salt to it. And it takes maybe a little bit more than you might suspect. When it goes in, I'm going to add a little stock just to start the process of dissolving that salt. And we'll whip it one last time. Now, I have a little bowl of water here, and oftentimes they will tell you that the way you can know that you've mixed this enough and whipped enough air into it is that you take a small amount and you put it into a bowl of water, and if it floats, you have arrived. So it looks to me like we've arrived. If we look in here and evaluate the consistency, it's like a cake batter. It's very, very soft, and I think it's important to taste it so that you know you have enough salt in there. And we're ready to make tamales. So if you take a look at our filling here, it's moist still, but there's not a lot of free liquid. I'm going to pull some of this filling out because I want to let it cool. I don't want to take the hot filling and put it onto that lard and just let it melt away to nothing. So I'm going to pull some out and let it cool. This filling needs to go into the freezer for just a second so that it cools down. So you can see here is our masa. Here's our batter made with corn masa. I want to take and roast some corn. I grilled this over an open flame just so it browned a little bit on the outside. And I'm going to add some of that corn right to the dough. I think it'll taste great. It'll look great. And I'm kind of excited about adding that. I'm just going to stir it right into the dough. And it'll just underscore the corn flavor of this tamale. Here I have the wrappers that we're going to use for the tamales. They get wrapped in corn husks, and you can buy them in the market just like this. They are dried. They dry them in the sun so that they're sort of bleached white, and all we need to do is cover them with hot water, and they will get very, very soft and be just what I need for shaping my tamales, okay? Now, I like to tie the tamales closed, and typically I do it with a little bit of this corn husk. So here's what I do. I take a piece and I rip it off, maybe a piece about 1/2 inch wide, and I rip it off, and at one end I tie a knot. And then I split everything leading up to the knot, and suddenly I have a nice long tie. I'm going to bring the filling right out of the freezer. All right. Step one is to grab one of these corn husks. And you'll find it has a concave side and a convex side. So I want the concave side. I want it to be a little bit of a cup. And with a big spoon, I'm going to take a portion of this dough or batter, and I'm going to put it in, and I'm going to spread it into roughly a rectangular shape towards the top. Not right at the very top, maybe a 3/4 of an inch down. And I would say that's about 1/4 of an inch thick. And I'm going to take filling, and put that right on top of the batter. And then I'm going to use this damp corn husk to bring the dough up and around the filling. Doesn't need to be completely contained, but I'm going to wrap it so that everything's inside. And then I want to take and pinch the bottom and fold it up so nothing will sneak out from below. All right, there's our tamale. I leave it open on the top because as it cooks, that baking soda is going to make it rise just a little bit. So to hold the folded up end, I'm going to take one of these ties and just tie a little knot. And I'll set it there. And we'll do the same thing again. So that's how you shape tamales. How do you cook them? Well, once they're shaped, you put together a steamer. And you want a pot of boiling water and maybe a colander that sits above that boiling water. And you place the tamales in the colander and you steam them. They steam for about an hour. So I've got a number of tamales that are already made here. Whenever you serve tamales, I would say it's a good idea to have a salsa on hand. I've got a green tomatillo salsa here. And the way you can tell they're done is you unwrap one and the wrapper should come away from the dough very cleanly. It shouldn't stick at all. So let me go ahead and put these right onto the plate, and then right on top I'm going to add this open tamale. And just so that people can see, I'm going to open up so the filling shows and maybe even add a little bit more. I think a branch or two of cilantro. Mushroom tamales with roasted tomatoes and poblanos and a green salsa on the side. If you've never made tamales before, you're in for a real treat. And if you have made tamales before, they're still delicious. So I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but there's one more little tidbit of information I'd love to share with you about mushrooms. Now, the largest organism in the world is not a giant blue whale or a giant redwood tree, but instead, it's a mushroom. Up in Oregon, they found a mushroom, a honey mushroom, that covers 2,400 acres. So imagine one plant covering the area of 1,600 football fields. I mentioned that when we eat a mushroom, what we're eating is the fruit, but the plant itself is the white filaments that grow through the soil and underneath the forest litter. When the conditions are right in terms of temperature and moisture, that's when the plant sends up mushrooms, and that's when you need to put a pan on the stove.